Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much all for waiting. So, no, we're about a minute overdue, but I believe we'll start now. So, my name's Sol. So, I work for Kinley. I work in the specification department, and today we have three lovely panelists. So, thank you very much all for attending. So, we have Veronica Flemming, who's a director of ASA Landscape Architects. The landscape architect Kinley work very closely with. And we have Neil Bowie, Kinley's technical manager. So lots of you would have spoke to Neil face to face or via Teams. And we also have Alistair Bayford from Frost Landscape, who's a managing director and another contractor that Kinley work very closely with as well. So today we will be going through the process really of a project. So starting with the design from concept to completion really. So we have Veronica talking about how a landscape architect to understand the site. And then we'll have Neil talking about the products and the best way to design them for the longevity. And we'll also have Alistair talking about how to create landscapes that stand the test of time from a contractor's point of view. So I will now pass over to Veronica. So thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Sol, for the introduction there. So I'm Veronica Flemming, Director at ASA Landscape Architects, and I'm delighted to explore how thoughtful site-led design can help us create landscapes that not only look beautiful on day one, but continue to thrive and adapt long into the future. So I know that there's probably quite a few landscape architects on the call. Some of these topics I cover might be self-evident, but I think the opportunity through design to stamp our own mark on a place can be quite tempting. And sometimes it's good just to take a step back and think these things through a little bit more. I think we've probably all seen designs which look good on paper, but it's clear that the designer in question has either not gone to site or has not thoroughly understood the site and how people will use the space. I would say worse still are the gimmicky designs, and I'd put artificial green walls into that category, which do not improve over time and are kind of counterproductive really to what we're trying to achieve as landscape designers. It's worth spending a moment to think about landscape design influence that have come and gone over time and which have stood the test of time. Best of luck to anybody whose design is still standing 5,000 years later. But I'm just going to touch upon the pre-Roman and ancient designers, our forefathers. So this is just really focusing, just quick summary of the European garden and landscape design. So obviously these were sacred natural enclosures, clearing forests, and early symbolic site planning. We don't really know exactly what or why some of these spaces were designed this way, but obviously they've with the natural materials to hand, they have stood the test of time. We then move on to Roman and medieval period with the introduction of formal and structured gardens, urban squares, often some irrigation in there, and often these medieval gardens combined utilitarian. They had a utilitarian purpose. They were there to provide food and to supplement people's diets. They might have also been associated with ecclesiastical or defensive built form. Um, and then we move on to the Renaissance with the revival of kind of classical ideas, emphasizing symmetry in art and the integration of gardens with architecture. These were generally a bit more of a human scale to what then followed, which is the Baroque, the 17th century, which is defined by drama and scale, such as André Le Nottre's work at the Palace of Versailles, featuring extensive geometric and orderly layouts. Best of luck if anybody gets a budget this big where you can lay out something like that. And then we move on to the 18th, 19th century, which is kind of the shift really to the English landscape style popularized by the Capability Brown, which had informal, romantic, naturalistic layouts, breaking from the strict geometry that preceded it. And it also introduced the 19th century idea of public parks for civic use. And then we move towards present day, where we have modern and contemporary design. It's a kind of professional shift towards urban planning, landscape preservation, and obviously understanding of our impact on the ecology around us. So modern projects generally try and prioritize biodiversity and social sustainability and manage climate impacts as reflected in some of the European standards that we see. And this is a lovely garden with designed by Pierre Oudolphe. So we see a lot of this in the planting palettes that are come to the fore with the kind of the naturalistic prairie style planting. Right, that's a whistle-stop tour of the history of landscape, I guess. So how can we take some of these thoughts and ideas forward to what we do on a day-to-day basis? I would say that As landscape architects, good design begins with understanding what makes a site unique and aligning the landscape response to the site constraints so that spaces function resiliently rather than fighting against their natural context. This is really through site-led design, ensuring we understand the desire lines, the views in and out, hydrology, soil conditions, the microclimate, the ecological networks, and the features. And also through integrating existing landscape features wherever feasible, trees and hedge lines, water features, built form, and also making sure we look outside of the red line boundary. What are the long views outside of our site, and can we frame those? Do we need to screen those? That kind of consideration. Then there's the consideration for maintenance. I'm going to touch upon this more than once. So we need to consider this from the outset. Are we designing for a low maintenance or a high maintenance scheme? What is the capabilities of the maintenance team going forward? What is their budget? And then integrating the use of biodiverse and climate resilient species, so native heavy mixes, balancing this with these requirements for aesthetics, costs and availability, and wherever possible, avoiding single species avenues and hedgerows. So the case study that you see just on the right there, this is one that we did at Newnham Courtney Garden, which happened to be set within a Capability Brown landscape. So had a kind of a historic tree planting that we responded to through the design of the walled garden by creating a wiggly walled garden that weaved in and out of the existing trees. We also integrated the change in the landform within the walled garden to work that into the design, so we had the kind of zoning, and we also tried to retain the long views out into the countryside whilst keeping the deer out. Hence, we had this kind of panelling that was integrated within the wiggly walls. So that was a lovely scheme to be part of. So moving on, I believe that as landscape architects, our role really is to guide clients on the cost benefits of landscape products and their plants and the ongoing maintenance requirements and how a product might perform over time. Naturally, this also needs to take into account all the other conflicting requirements of a project, such as carbon, provenance, costs, aesthetics, lead times, so on and so forth. And through that, we can really guide a client as to what's going to be best for best products for that particular use. So a case study here is the recently completed Signal Yard on Milton Park, where, as you can see on the left-hand side beforehand, it was a fairly tired scheme that was done in the 2000s with concrete paving, so concrete pavers everywhere, which were, well, just had faded and looked very cold. So we worked with the client to think about what the alternative was. And I was loath to, although the existing built form was being retained, obviously there's quite a lot of being put in. So I was loath to take out concrete pavers and put in more concrete pavers. And so we came across the use of brick to add the warmth and the interest to it. So they did come with a higher upfront cost, but it provided a more premium finish. We believe that over time it would age well and have a patina to it. And the products can also be lifted, flipped, when inevitably someone drops a kebab on it or something. So it provided that longevity that we were looking for the client. And so that's been very successful. So I'm sure Sol and Neil will touch upon other hard landscaping choices which will be designed for longevity. So I'm going to move on with planting. I cannot emphasize enough, it starts with soil. We need to understand that from the outset. So before you open your planting books, really, we need to understand what's going on under our feet. I would advise looking at Magic Map as a starting point. We also advise quite a few of our clients to work with people like Timmer Hare Associates who do professional soil testing. And they also create some really user-friendly reports about what we can do to ameliorate them and help retain soil on site. So that's what the aim is, to try and reuse existing soils wherever possible. And then if that's not possible, try and specify the correct type of soil when importing, again guided by the British standards for topsoils and subsoils, which are appropriate to their location and their use. And again, for complex sites, you can also work with soil scientists to provide kind of bespoke mixes for particular planting mixes. And then once we've got the right soils, and we've specified them, we need to make sure through the specification that contractors provide you with in-date soil certificates ahead of it arriving to site. And there's also the opportunity to design planting for no soils. So I'm just going to show you a little case study of the recycle garden we did at Milton Park. This was a kind of an experimental area adjacent to an existing lagoon where we used crush construction waste and aggregates within a structured form to provide a substrate for quite a biodiverse planting mix. This recreates a substrate that's very similar to like a chalk downland. It's quite alkaline, it's incredibly free draining, it's low nutrient, and so wildflower mixers really appreciate it. And it's also been very resilient to flooding and very high temperatures as well, and relatively weed free. So it's been very successful and something we'd like to replicate again. Right, moving on. Designing for planting. Again, once we've understood the soils, we need to think a little bit more about the planting typologies. So it's worthwhile going and looking and understanding in detail what is growing well on site or nearby, what has failed, and refer to the NVC, the National Vegetation Classification books, to understand local plant communities and sub-communities to ensure planting proposals tie in and support this. We need to think about planting for resilience, selecting plants and plant communities that are diverse and layered, drought resistant, and preferably with a strong native component. We need to consider watering. If you are lucky enough to working on a kind of a completely new site, try and build that in from the outset. If not, understand where are the watering points, what's possible, can we design in bib taps from the outset, or even automatic irrigation systems if it's appropriate, say it's up on a terrace. And how will the maintenance team keep your scheme alive? There is no such thing as a no maintenance planting. Once it's established, it's can tolerate quite a bit, but for the first 2 to 3 years, really, especially for trees, that watering needs to take place manually. And then there's the construction program. Is it likely to slip? Do the planting mixes or the planting plants that you've specified, do they need to be containerized? Some planting areas, especially trees and shrub, native shrub planting, may be better to be pushed back into the November-March period to give it the best start. And what's the availability like? I might have mentioned it once or twice before. Ongoing maintenance, especially on green walls and roofs. Is it safe? Has risk been minimised? Is it through a tenant demise? There are schemes that come to us that have got planning permission, and you think, well, it's got a green wall, but how? There's no way for the roots to get into the ground. How are people going to access this thing to maintain it in the future? We really do need to guide our clients on that. And then this is going to be explored a little bit more, but the day after the rectification period or practical completion, it's arranging handover meetings and agreeing on maintenance schedules to make sure that everybody's on board. So the next case study I've got is the Bee House at Milton Park, where we worked closely with Boddingale Nurseries and using some of the research from Sheffield University. This was an existing building and we retrofitted a new landscape around it, getting rid of quite a bit of car parking and putting in rain gardens at the front. And through these rain gardens, they have very deep gravel mulches, and they also have a plant mix that makes sure that there is colour and interest throughout the season. And it's also been very successful in attracting lots of bees. We designed some signage you can just see on the right hand side there, which I was very pleased to see last year was chock full of solitary bees, to the point where people were messaging me saying, "There's bees." I'm like, well, that was the point. So that it was great to see it was successful. Right, moving on. Not all landscapes are designed to be permanent. So sometimes we have these opportunities to design landscapes that we know are really going to only be there for a few years. Maybe it's a development plot. So these temporary landscapes, this is one that we did for a wandering feast concept. And we integrated movable planters and benches and structures which could then be relocated elsewhere when the site needed to be repurposed and reconfigured, but still created that sense of enclosure and movement and interest and character that was lacking from what was otherwise a load of tarmac and car parking. Moving on, we also need to, when designing for flexibility, be considerate. We need to think that the building form around the landscape might change its use, and therefore the landscape needs to respond to that. So this is an example of this. This is a podium landscape that we had done 12, 13 years or so prior, when the building was 100% office blocks. Then post-COVID, the ground floor became a cafe space, and we were invited back in to reimagine some of the areas of landscape to make them a little bit more intimate in their space and their feel, and create kind of cafe breakout spaces, which we did whilst making sure we did not disturb the waterproofing underneath. Hence, we have these kind of large planters. So this was quite successful to reimagine and reconfigure the landscape for a slight change in use. So just in conclusion, when we design for longevity, really the design is not just about the material selection, but rather considering the site's evolution over time. A design needs to balance aesthetics with stewardship and adaptability, and we need to aim to create resilient environments that mature over time. I certainly think that honest materials can do that and age quite gracefully. And then we need to design to respond to a site's unique features. Wherever feasible, integrate native plant communities and adaptive water management to withstand the climatic shifts that we're all facing. And we need to consider social flexibility and multifunctional spaces, because the landscape that you design from the outset might have a different use in decades to come. And I think realistically, we need to consider from the outset that a successful landscape is not finished on opening day. Rather, it is a long-term dialogue between the designer's intent and the forces of nature and the community that inhabits it. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. That was very informative, and I'm sure there's going to be a few questions. I saw one already came in, so thank you very much. All questions will be answered at the end. Apologies for not saying at the start. But yes, thank you very much, Veronica. That was great. And now I'll be moving on to Neil Bowie, so you're from Kinley and the technical manager, talking about Kinley's landscape metal edging.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again, Veronica. It was very interesting and insightful presentation. So here to talk a bit about the problem of concrete. It has been a default for decades, and I must admit, I thought as Veronica went over all those projects and the amount of hard work it goes over, the special soil and all that, it does seem a bit of a shame to go and put concrete into these scenarios, particularly when they create further problems. So, I mean, we all know about concrete and what can happen to it. We see a lot of it, particularly with climate change, where we have extra rainfall, we have extra warmer summers, and concrete is adversely affected by these. When it reaches the end of its life, it has a minimal use. And like it says here, it's part of the urban heat islands. So the urban heat islands, the cities in that we live, in which, according to statistics, 55% of the world's population work in, is something that we're trying to combat with these extra green areas. So the life cycle of traditional edge, well, it is a straight cycle, really. It's not actually a cycle. It's not actually a circle. You've got the concrete, it gets put into the ground, and then after a while, after however many years it takes, depending on its location, because it can be quite vulnerable in situations, and as soon as it starts to crack, then you get the climate change affecting it. So you get the extra rainfall that we have starting to wash away those parts, and then it ends up being crushed and having a minimal use. Timber is the same. Timber, again, doesn't like the climate change. So we need to think of using products which are resilient to the change of climate and don't have a negative area on the planting that we're trying to increase. So here we've got aluminium. Aluminium is an excellent product to use for an edge, and rarely would you actually see it. It doesn't take away from the nice design that has already been created, and it is a product which will last for many years. You can see the 6005 grade A aluminium. This is not just any old aluminium. It's not like a Coke can or something like that. It is a better quality aluminium, which is designed to go the time. It's designed to be used with hot tarmac and things like that. It is also useful for other products as well, like ladders and fire extinguishers, bus shelters, things like that. And steel also is a product which can be infinitely recycled. So it gets used, it gets installed, it gets dismantled, and then it gets reused. And these products, aluminium and steel, are products that you can do that infinitely with. So they're really good products to use going forward. So you've got this circular economy where the metal edging can be removed, recycled, reused, and because it lasts a long time, there's less disruption. It seems a shame to put in an edge that perhaps will only last 8 to 10 years and then have to dig it up, encroaching into that habitat which might have built up over the years, to then dig it out over 10 years when you can actually use a product which could last you 40, 50 years. And then with the no concrete in the ground, as you can install with both aluminium and steel systems, they don't need concrete in the ground, so you don't have that leaching of chemical going into the planting area. As I said earlier, it seems a shame to go to the expense of really good quality soil only to have concrete there haunching, leaching into that soil and perhaps affecting the plants. So, and this is another thing about concrete, is there's not so much control over how much actually gets into the ground. And we often see grass dieback of up to, well, I've seen it up to 400 wide in some particular extreme cases where you get the grass dying, and it spoils the project. It doesn't make it look so good, and it makes you wonder what happens when you've got planting there. What kind of adverse effect is it doing to the plant, particularly when we want those plants to do as well as possible, because they are helping to take off the effects of the climate change. They're using some of the extra water that falls out there. They're absorbing the sun's rays, helping us in the urban heat islands to get a better environment. So you've got a product like AluXL which will last for 20 to 50 years. And the picture on the right, which is King's Cross, and you can't actually see the edging there, but it's obvious where it is. All you can see is the path and the planting next to it. Now these plants here have done very well, even better if you go and see them today. They have very much grown up a lot more. But you've got an edge there which will be there for as long as it needs to be used. And being 100% recyclable, and it's low environment, there's no concrete. Most installations of this type, it's only specialist installations that you would have to normally bring the concrete back into play. It can fix a lot of problems, I get that, with concrete, but in a lot of situations, no concrete is needed. All you need is the L-shaped or I-shaped product, or in the case of bison, the T-shaped product, and you've got the pins in place, and that is sufficient to hold an edge in place. So it's a very efficient system, very much quicker, very much what I call the contractor's friend, particularly when you get into the winter months where you can't actually use concrete because it's too cold. This is a product that you can continue to use all the year round. So it's very flexible, can take a lot of weight. It's a bit of a myth that some think that aluminium edging or steel edging is not very strong. It is a very strong product. And unlike timber or concrete, if that cracks or breaks, it breaks down a lot quicker. You don't have that situation with a steel, or particularly a core 10 steel. If someone bends it, it's just a bent piece of steel. It will still last the time. It will still give you the 40 odd years that you need from your edge. And it's proven to be, this is for the bison curve that you can see, it's proven to be up to 52% carbon reduction over a standard concrete pin curve. This takes everything into account, and this is on a standard install. As soon as you get a haunch that is too wide, then that carbon difference is a lot more. So this takes into account that you don't need any concrete. It's a lighter product to use, and therefore it's lighter to distribute. handle and manage. So the install of these kind of products as well is very key, because with a nice design, you want nice flowing edges that stay in line and don't come misaligned and therefore become a weak point. All the products that Kinley have made have taken this in mind, and they are joined together to fix a continuous, nice straight line. So that looks neat, though, as I've said, with many situations, you can't actually see the edge. It is just a continuous, thin, nice line. So there's lots of different finishes. So if you're a designer looking for a different finish, with aluminium, you've got anodizing, you've got a brushed stainless steel look, and you've got a powder coating look. So there's, within those three areas, there's a lot of different colors. So if you don't actually want to see the edge, you can powder coat it a dark color so that it actually blends in with the mulch or the bark or the soil which is next to it, and therefore you don't actually see the edge. It makes for a nice seamless design. There is also there's core 10 galvanized or stainless steel. Now we have done one or two projects now in stainless steel. It's a marine grade stainless steel. It is, of course, quite a lot more expensive, but if your client is interested in that, you've got a product which looks really nice and has a very long lifespan. And of course, core 10 is still a popular one with a lot of people. It's not popular with everybody. I actually quite like it from the point of view of its resilience. I like the fact that it can, because these type of systems, they're in areas where it might be a lot of traffic, a lot of people, they do tend to get knocked and scuffed. But with core 10, it rusts over and comes back. And galvanized is the age-old system that we used to see on warehouses for gutters and downpipes. It's a proven product against the elements, and really, really good product to think about, particularly, as I say, you're hardly going to see it in a lot of situations. So there's a few projects we've done over the years, some classic old Kinley ones, which we love. As you can see, the area here all broken up by an edge, a planter system, there's benches there as well. One thing I always notice about the overhead pictures of this project is you've got a bit of grass dying there, but that's nothing to do with concrete underneath. That shows you the popularity of the area. So come lunchtime, you'll find, particularly in the summer, a lot of people come out here and they would sit on the grass, have lunch, chat, talk, and this is what happens. It's overlooking the water, that far patch where you can see most of the grass having a struggle to survive. But what this says to me is that we haven't got enough areas like this in the cities, and this is what we want more. So there's more of these type of spaces to go to for people to enjoy and just to feel more relaxed in as well. So you mustn't forget the biophilia side of it, and of course where people live. This is Kidbrook Village. Project has been going for years, and I think you might almost think this was an airbrush picture or something, but I think this is classic of how edging can help the growing area. And you can just see that very slim aluminium edge, which will, to be honest, it will be there until it's taken out. I've known edging of aluminium, or not, I've known aluminium to go for 80 years and still be usable. The planting here is right to the edge. The grass is growing really nicely. And it is a very classic example of what you can expect from an edge system like this, whether it's aluminium or steel. And there's just no concrete there to have any adverse effect on that planting area. So this is another old Kinley project, London Wall, one of our favourites, and often is on our back screen. It's a core 10 edge. I know quite a few people tend to think that core 10 will leach, and it can be a problem. The higher your planter edge, the more leaching you're obviously going to get. If you have a chance to go past London Wall, you'll notice there's a slight gap where the leaching could go if that was a problem, so it doesn't affect the light coloured pavers. So this is, again, a really nice project. It was a bespoke one, which Kinley does. And again, this is a nice area which you will always see a lot of people going to. And with the Core 10 edging, you're looking at something like 40 to possibly even 50 years of use in this kind of environment. So a very nice project to work on. I think that is all from me this time. I'll pass back over to Sol now. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Neil. That was great to see, and obviously always lovely to hear about Kinley's metal edging, something we're all passionate about, maximising planting, reducing carbon by reducing concrete. So I see a couple of questions are coming in, so that's great. Thank you very much. So yeah, please remember to chuck them into the Q&A box. I see, Veronica, you've answered one, so that's great as well. Thank you very much. And now I'll pass over to Alistair, the Managing Director from Frost Landscapes. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sol. Just to introduce myself, and good morning. Thanks for joining us. That was a brilliant segue, Neil, into my bit, showcasing London Wall and the work we delivered down there. Crikey, would have been like 8 years ago now. I'm Alistair Bayford, Managing Director of Frost Landscapes Construction. I am a Fellow of the Landscape Institute and a Board Director of the British Association of Landscape Industries, which is the trade body for contractors. I've spent 25 years across design, construction and maintenance. I've had that pleasure of having multiple hats over my career. So I have seen projects through from kind of planning and concept to delivery on site, and then dealt with that long-term stewardship conundrum. Big part of my career, over 10 years, was spent at Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park during all phases of the development there, through design, through games, through transformation, and then was there for a further 8 years managing the park alongside some other stuff. So that's really shaped how I consider and think about longevity. I'm going to come at this from a contractor's lens, not theory, but what actually happens when you try to deliver these schemes in reality. So time, cost and quality, I think we're all familiar with that project triangle. There is a balance between them. There is push and pull on those three factors. So if you want it quickly, you often have to pay more. If you want great quality, you often have to pay more. But ultimately, we have this big thing now overlaying all three. So environmental considerations, whether that's carbon, climate resilience, water, we have to really consider that across all aspects of project considerations. But the reality hasn't really changed. Program still dominates, cost still drives a number of decisions, and quality is often judged at, I'd say, handover, but roll it on 12 months to end of defects. It's not considered at 5 years, 10 years and 15 years. And that's kind of something we don't really consider. And I often use that phrase when I'm talking to my project managers. Let's judge it in use. Let's judge it once it's had time to establish, and let's judge your hard landscape 5-10 years on from practical completion. But what actually happens in practice is that I believe environmental ambition gets squeezed currently into that model that I've just described. And it can't sit on the edge anymore. It has to be central to the decisions that we make, and is a core constraint to those three factors that affect projects. Importantly, unless we consider it, we'll just keep making short-term decisions that undermine long-term performance. Risk and PI insurance. It's one of the biggest influences on all projects, and it's one we don't talk about enough. A lot of the decisions that are made about performance are actually about liability. So, something I see often is over-specification, belt and braces detailing, complex systems designed to protect positions, and at the same time, risk being transferred to the contractor. And we were in a period of time where you just take the contractual liability of 6 years. We're signing contracts now with liability extending to 12, if not 15 years post completion. And the result of that tends to play out in more material being used to build these schemes, more complexity, more cost as a result, and more carbon. And ironically, they're much harder to build. So rather than removing risk, we're just kind of moving it around from party to party. And for me, it's much more about aligning risk with control. If you're asking someone to carry the risk, we need to be able to influence the decisions and the detail. And in reality, simpler, well-resolved details almost always outperform the complex ones. My stage 4 design versus reality. I think this is probably the one factor we see most on sites. Stage 4 is issued as complete, but in reality, key things aren't fully resolved. Services aren't quite where they're expected, levels don't quite work, interfaces between trades are still open, particularly if the package distribution and design responsibility is not pinned down. And that's primarily where a number of the problems sit. Drainage up against thresholds, planters against the waterproofing, build-ups against the structure. And invariably what happens is that contractors are resolving this stuff live on site, under program pressure, and with partial information. So inevitably that leads to compromise, whether that's time, quality, or cost. For me, I think stage 4 should mean what it meant when I started my career, which is buildable. You tender on stage 4, so the scheme should be buildable. And if it's not fully resolved, that's absolutely fine, but that needs to be identified during that tender process so that we know what gaps we need to be filling. Define what's fixed, what's flexible, and lock down the critical interfaces early. M&E tends to be that afterthought now. Number of times I've dug up, or the teams have dug up planting schemes to run junction boxes and lighting schemes post planting. And that tree example to the right there, this is probably the most common thing I see on any project. It's where that tree, whether it's a tree grill or a tree pit at surface level, not accounting for these root flares or high root plates that trees have. So that Corylus corona, it's got a pretty high root flare, and that's it planted 200 mil below surface level with this reactive drainage board wrapped around the trunk to prevent the material sitting up against the trunk. And we always see it on tree grill details where the frame and the construction requirements there mean that the tree is sat almost 200 to 300 mil below finished level, and that gap around the bough of the tree then becomes an area where the client would question the risk in use. So again, you'll see it on streets in London, whereby that's backfilled with either a loose gravel or a bound gravel, which then isn't monitored or managed during management. Right plant, right place, and let's do it for real. Leaning back on some of the things in Veronica's presentation, I don't think we talk about planting enough. I don't think we talk about planting as a system in terms of vegetative and soil, soil being the most important component to any successful planting scheme. There are excellent schemes out there. The work that we do as an industry, there are plenty of benchmarks for excellence, but we still see the same pallets of planting regardless of context. You could be anywhere in the UK. There isn't that specialness of using your reference points in the surrounding landscape. Site response is incredibly important. Understanding your soil. There's 6 types in the UK, and whilst we do use BS manufactured soils, often they're not reflective of site. So, if you've got particularly acid soils, you therefore have acid loving planting. We put a very alkaline soil in, you're not going to have that same level of planting context. limited climate resilience. I'm still staggered by how a lack of resilience in our planting and the number of riparian species still being specified in a London context, and species prone to disease or pests or fungal issues. So Amelanchier, specified everywhere, but suffers greatly with mildew, to the plant's detriment, ultimately, visually, aesthetically, and its health. But is one of the most common specified trees in London. And increasingly, schemes just dependent on irrigation just to survive. I call our management team an ICU unit in summer, running around distributing water to keep things alive. And that's driven primarily by things like urban heat, wind exposure, very shallow build-ups, particularly on roofs and podiums, creating those hostile environments, highly permeable soils, subsoils, tree stands that are draining at 500 mil an hour, plus a tree transpiring. You have to put a lot of water into the system in those early years to get them established. And when irrigation fails, there's an issue. And sometimes there is a stark realization of a building manager or a building operator when they receive the water bill for water usage to support a roof terrace. So for me, right plant, right place has to mean right conditions too, and designing it as a system which extends down into the soil. And that needs to be considered when ultimately selecting your plant palette. We also need to get very comfortable with a different aesthetic. Landscapes sell, but importantly, the landscapes that sell are often these very glossy, very verdant planting schemes. And, specifiers have the ear of the client at the start, and they need to be managing those expectations and taking clients on a journey that our landscapes will have to look different into the future. And importantly, we need to communicate this shift to growers. Nurseries will continue to grow Betula pendula and sell it as long as it keeps getting specified. And I believe there's a real opportunity to diversify our planting palette, where it's appropriate. Riparian species are absolutely appropriate, but in London, I could list off Astraea, Parotia, Heptacodium, Nyssa, all brilliant species that contribute towards the performance of public realm. And that image on the right-hand side is a birch tree from last summer, planted last spring, with the contents of its phloem boiling in the heat and the temperatures. So that is blistering of effectively sugars in the sap. That tree will not survive in the landscape, therefore is a victim of perhaps the conditions we have today. And boy, it's changed in the last 5 years, more so across the entire of my career, and the suitability of species in a London urban setting. The reality of programme, this is where often I have a gun to my head. It's still one of the biggest drivers of risk on any project. It's the main contributor to pushing planting out of season. And once we start talking about coir wrapped root balls, that those trees are being planted in that period, April to August, because they can't be spring rooted in air pots. You'd do too much damage to emerging roots if you were. So we're artificially containerizing a root ball that's been lifted in the dormant season to extend that planting window to meet programme. Sequencing often driven by completion dates, and LADs are influencing behaviour. I'll speak candidly about that, but for as long as if you've got £45,000 worth of LADs a week and it costs you £2,500 to replace a tree, PC is being achieved. And that's primarily because of risk. And that tree may well survive it, but ultimately that image on the right is very, very common for me, in the sense of often we are placing trees in a situation where failure is ultimately the outcome, whether that's in year one or whether that's just really poor establishment, and trees therefore not thriving is dependent on ultimately timing. There's obviously a huge commercial consequence of LADs, and you see it on the front pages. Certainly big highways infrastructure schemes where you'd almost consider the soft landscape to be disposable. Designing for maintenance, Veronica's mentioned this, and I would say it's the bit that's missing. I've spent a lot of time looking after landscape, and we don't always design with maintenance in mind, the skills required, the budget available. And when we do, it's often prescriptive rather than being led and influenced by that big yellow dot in the sky. Employ gardeners who use their hands and secateurs. They're often influenced by what is happening climatically. But we do need to consider access. What is the access strategy for the green wall or the bit of planting outside the balustrade? The systems can be overly complex, and ownership isn't always clear. Think about the stakeholders involved in any scheme. And believe me, once the client's gone, the main contractor's gone, the landscape architect design team has gone, we're dealing with a building manager who ultimately is an expert, and or not. But their expectations, the clients using the building, their expectations, everybody has a different perception of what landscape is, just like art. So bringing them on a journey is incredibly important. Budgets change, systems can fail, and landscapes often need to survive with very, very little input. So the question at design stage should be, how does this perform in year 3, not week 3? If it can't be maintained easily, it won't perform. And the examples on the slide are, running through those. That top image is a scheme we planted 4 years ago. Verdant scheme, highly dependent on irrigation, the cost of irrigation, and importantly, long-term sustainability has driven the decision to replant it with a very steep-like planting scheme. Low water requirements, certainly less impactful from being green, but certainly more sustainable, certainly more suited to a level 13 roof terrace, but a very different aesthetic, which required the client to be brought on that journey. And then timber benches. Those benches I installed in 2012. They're very expensive benches. Some of you may well recognise them. Sell at about £5,000 a piece. So add a bit of installation cost, you're up at 6. There's 20 on the scheme in question, quoted as having a design life of 15 to 25 years. That picture was taken 10 years later. And ultimately, I think design gets eroded by the fact that you consider a client replacing 20 benches at that value. That's 100,000, if not more, investment in replacing benches that are only halfway through their life. Closing the title of this slide, we are obsessed with carbon at the minute. We talk about it a lot, but we tend to only focus really on the materials. In reality, a lot of carbon sits in the decisions. Whether that's over designing to minimise risk, unresolved design leading to redesign, program pressures leading to failure and replacement. All of that carries carbon, not least the operational carbon that it takes a contractor to install these schemes. One of the biggest opportunities is simply getting it right first time, reducing the complexity, avoiding rework, making better decisions earlier in the process so that we're not trying to resolve things on site. And even something as simple as tree size has a significant impact on carbon. Transport, the number of trees you can physically get onto a load. You can get more 1618s on a load than you can 3035s. The type of construction plant to move this stuff changes. Planting methodology changes, and all of the sundries that sit below ground. So that table on the slide is a number of sundries with their relative carbon associated with them. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, nearly 10 products within a tree pit alone. And I think we need to also consider establishment as being a massive factor in carbon usage and resource usage, vital resources when you consider water. And I'm going to say it, the 10-year question. So I'm now going into projects I built at the start of my career to refurbish them, completely change them. And this is a question I keep coming back to, especially when I'm asked to do a whole life carbon assessment. How long do these landscapes actually last? We can talk about products, you know, that great quote that Neil gave you of 6005 aluminium lasting for 30 years. Brilliant. Will it last on the site for 30 years is the biggest question. Because many schemes are refurbished, redesigned, redeveloped within 10 to 15 years. So what does design life really mean? And what does whole life carbon mean in the life of a shorter project? This example that I've got on the slide is that project that was built in 2012. I went back 10 years later to find someone to replace that lovely natural turf lawn with an artificial lawn. You know, all of the carbon involved in both installing the natural lawn first and then replacing it wasn't assumed at the start during the design process. So we need to think seriously about sustainability and consider design life, actual lifespan, and the client's ultimate intent. Otherwise, we're just designing for a future that never really happens. And just to close my my slides, if I bring that all together, landscapes last when a few things align. The design, you know, ultimately the design is genuinely resolved. Interfaces are properly thought out. Risk sits for the people that can really influence it. And we design for real conditions, not ideal ones. And because ultimately landscapes don't fail because of one bad decision. They fail because the system around them doesn't quite line up. Or, as per that image, you just end up doing really daft stuff because someone put something on a line on a drawing. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alistair. That was great to hear as well. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. It's lovely to see and hear, see the whole the progress of a project, starting from the concept all the way to the completion. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat for a few different people. So I'll quickly go through them for the rest of the time we have. And the first one is for you, Neil. So we have Helen has asked, we've got a lot of core 10 raised beds that have been graffitied. Do your edgings have any way of dealing with this problem?
Well, as we know, graffiti is a problematic thing. The thing about core 10 is it is what I tend to think of core 10 as a bit of a living material. It does change over time, and with the elements, that graffiti will gradually come off. But I think Alistair might be able to say something about this, as he's probably got more of a hands-on experience as to graffiti on planters. Could you help, Alistair?
Yeah, so it's just the impact it has visually when you remove it, trying to remove it with perhaps less intensive chemicals. So it does come off quite cleanly with a pressure washer, but you'll see it. But that said, you can rework core 10. So just a light scouring and a kind of a circular motion will bring it back out. And within a couple of days, you'll have the oxidization to tone it back. But I would try to treat that as a panel rather than in isolation. So if you're going to remove graffiti, extend the area to about 1 meter offset from the finish, and then it shouldn't be so impactful visually.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Apologies, I was on mute. Thank you very much, both. Got another question here, and from Shivy from Kingston University. So this is for anyone, but I'll ask you, Veronica, as it came in when you was doing your speech, if that's okay. So the question is, are teams looking at biodiversity and where some of the prairie style planting and species can negatively impact neighbouring sites, where the plants can spread through either by themselves? Oh, sorry, another question just came in. either by themselves or through how the maintenance is conducted, especially where BNG is in play. As a site manager, another question's coming, which is bringing it down. As a site manager, I've not really seen this reflected in operations and maintenance documents post-project on the landscape side of things. Also, regarding the soil, how many landscape architects are on site when the soil comes in and check that it's been handled properly?
Gosh, lots of questions there. I'll start with the first bit, which I think I understand is about the question about the use of prairie planting, which obviously a lot of it originates from North America. Um, a key, I mean, I went to Sheffield University, and so I was very lucky to have people like Nigel Dunnett and James Hitchmer as my mentors. Um, the driver there is about extending the colour, the interest, and nectar availability of the season. But and recreating a kind of an augmented wildflower meadow, though it's not a truly UK native wildflower meadow. And so I can understand the concern about how that will then has the potential to knock out our kind of natural systems. I think if you're talking about implementing it in a city centre environment, that is there's other priorities there about colour and maintenance, and there is no doubt there's still nectar. You know, a bee is not going to go onto an echinacea because it's from North America originally. It will still be able to access and enjoy that. But I do take your point where you are connecting through to natural systems, and this is where you've really got to look outside of that red line boundary. We need to think maybe a true native wildflower situation might be appropriate. But yes, I mean there's always this payoff between colour and interest and seasonal interest that some of the non-natives provide versus our native mixes, which don't have that extension of interest. The question about soils. It's not about how many landscape architects need go to site. It's about timing, I would say. We work closely with our main contractors and our soft landscape contractors to ensure that, you know, it's very clear in the specification, expectations are set, and then I'm on the phone saying, when is it arriving? I mean, I want to see the certificates before it arrives to site. When it arrives to site, I want to see it. I want to see it's being stored properly. I want to see it looks and feels and smells and is what I'm expecting it to be. And there isn't the cross contamination, because often sites can be tight and it's kind of dumped there and it's next to something else, and before you know it's all mixed and jumbled through. So that's I think the important role that the landscape architect, one of the important roles that the landscape architect can do during the construction period. And I know some clients, you know, see us as we get it through planning, we get it through tender. What's the point of a landscape architect through the construction period? But to be eyes and ears for the client and to make sure the quality is maintained, I find it's invaluable.
I'll just add
Perfect.
to those points because
Yeah, of course.
I mean, using that prairie style planting in reality, obviously at Limpet Park we had what was described as stitch planting around the development platforms that were in close proximity to the Biodiversity Action Plan habitat. So lots of species-rich grassland. It does also come down to knowledge,
Yeah.
you know, ensuring that you've got the right skills on site and ensuring that these moving schemes are not only not impacting outside of that space, but importantly aren't being eroded by seeds being lost. You know, the fact that these things self-perpetuate means that you need people that aren't going to be hoeing off emerging seedlings of detriment to the scheme. And then with soil, yes, you have those overseeing and supervising the implementation. But as a contractor, we're producing ITPs with important hold points. So, you know, sampling being approved, testing being approved, decompaction being approved. That formation level is one of the key areas for a hold point and a check that it's been prepared and ripped properly before incoming soils are then placed on top. So ITPs are central really to success and audit of the works of a contractor.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Alistair. Obviously, I can see the time. There's a few more questions, but I think we have time for one more question, and then all the other questions we can get back to you privately. So I'll go to the question. The next one will be Jenny. And Alistair, I'll ask you from your past experience if this has happened. And the question is, if the benches have failed after 10 years and not achieved their design life, then is there an opportunity to go back to the manufacturer? Has anything like this happened for you?
Don't know how long have we got to come back to a Kinley product if it fails? It comes down to management maintenance ultimately. I mean, those examples, I don't think those benches have necessarily been sanded, oiled during those 10 years of life. So, we are seeing still oak being specified very regularly. It's not the ideal timber for heavy use or maintenance strategies which are zero input. So very durable hardwood, preferably reclaimed, very durable hardwood, takes out belts and braces. Assume there's no maintenance to really think about what it looks like in 10 years. But yes, I mean if there's extended warranties and it's been maintained in accordance with manufacturers' recommendations, you can absolutely leverage a replacement if it hasn't achieved design life. But it's incredibly difficult in my experience. Things usually fail because they're not being maintained.
Yes, no, of course. Well, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for your answer as well. Like I said, there's a few more questions which we'll come back to privately if that's all okay, as I don't want to overrun. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you all to our panelists, Veronica, Alistair, and Neil. It's been a pleasure hearing and answering your questions. Obviously, if there's anything Kinley can do from our side, we'll always be more than happy to help. And I know Alistair and Veronica will do the same as well. But no, thank you very much, everyone, and we will speak to you soon.